Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it is time to resume WTFGAS podcast. After a long absence, I decided to come back and make some new content. Tomorrow, I start a new job. I just recently finished my PhD. I've mentioned that on my main channel. And so, having a bit of sleeplessness and also experiencing a bit of nostalgia because this is a pretty massive change in my life. And I decided to go back and chronicle my childhood video game collection. That's something I've been working on today in lieu of finishing one of my syllabi that's been a major pain in the ass, because let's face it, who the hell wants to write a syllabus? I decided to start with Super Nintendo because Super Nintendo is a system, I think it was the second system I ever got. It's still one of my favorites, and unlike the Sega Genesis, I only ever had a fairly limited collection until I was an adult. There are a couple reasons why I ended up with less Super Nintendo games as opposed to Genesis. The first reason is simply that I preferred the Genesis, by and large. Now, obviously there were some games on Super Nintendo that were better than what you could get on Genesis, but for the most part, I preferred Genesis versions of games that were third-party, and also when it came to exclusives, I tended to prefer what Genesis had on offer when compared with what Nintendo had on offer. That's also partly a reflection of what my gaming tastes were at this time when I was, say, 7 to 10 or 11 years old. I was not really into RPGs and some of the things that people say makes the SNES a true classic. And over the years, as I've gotten more into those things, I've come to appreciate the Super Nintendo more. That being said, I'm also really into strategy games, and actually the Genesis had a better strategy library. So, although I played the Genesis a great deal more as a kid, when I do retro gaming today, I actually find myself a little more drawn to the Genesis than the Super Nintendo, but both of them are still colossal influences in my entertainment life. So, the other reason, though, as I mentioned there were two, is that Super Nintendo games are a lot more expensive. A lot of people don't remember this, or perhaps they didn't have to ever think about this, but Super Nintendo games typically were $10 to $20 to $30 more than Genesis games, and since I was really into things like Mortal Kombat and other things that came out for multiple platforms, I was aware that I could basically get the same game for less and still get more stuff for my birthday or Christmas or whatever when I was asking for presents from my parents and grandparents. And also sometimes I'd buy these myself when I had money. That wasn't too often, because again I was like 7 to 11 years old, but it did happen on occasion, and usually when that happened it was something that I found on sale or something that was reprinted. Actually, the last two games I acquired for SNES before I became an adult were games that I found when I was out looking for PS1 and 2 stuff at Toys R Us. They had made some reprints, and I'm 99% sure they were reprints because they had black and white manuals, which was not something that you saw too often with SNES stuff. So, anyway, let's go through these games, and although there are 11 here, I don't think I ever owned more than 8 at a time. And I'm not sure exactly how I know that so precisely, but I used to keep very close track of my games when I was a kid. Now, since then, starting in 2009 or so, I started to actually collect more stuff. And I continued that until a few years ago. At this point, I think I pretty much have everything that I want, except for Front Mission 3 for the PS1. So, yeah, I haven't really been game shopping in a few years, but I have a lot more than this now, and I obviously missed out on a good number of SNES classics. And I did, of course, play more than what's on here as well. I played the Donkey Kong Country games. I knew about Mario All-Stars. I think I tried Mortal Kombat 2 on SNES. I remember doing some other stuff on here, but I never happened to own the games. I also remember renting Mario is Missing, which was dreadful. So anyway, here are my childhood SNES games ranked. First up, we have Top Gear. This game actually holds a special place in my heart. I think I've mentioned in the past, in passing, that I am not a big racing fan. Racing is probably my least favorite game genre. But this game's an exception to that, because I actually have very fond memories of playing this. It's one that I can still pick up and play to this day and have a good time with. The scrolling in the game is great. And while I have acquired the 2 sequels for this in the years since, I still prefer this one. The soundtrack is better, and I just kind of prefer the way it feels. So this one, for me, brings back a lot of fond memories. I also played this a lot with my dad. There were only a handful of games that he would play with me when we lived in Georgia when I was elementary school age, and Top Gear was one of them. He liked to try to put the game into manual. And I always thought, yeah, I can't use manual because I don't know how to drive yet, but one day I'll know how to use the manual controls on this. I've still never figured out how to use the manual controls on this game, even though I have been driving for a long time now. So I guess that was one expectation that got dashed. But Top Gear, good game. A little bit of strategy in the longer games because you have to figure out when you need to take your pit stop and how to space out your nitro boost. Good graphics, good soundtrack. Decent enough control. For me, Top Gear is a solid A. I imagine this is not one that most people would expect as sort of like my top choice for an SNES racer. Most people, I guess, played Mario Kart. I never had Mario Kart. I played it as an adult, mostly because my girlfriend got nostalgic for it, so I found a copy and we played. Good game, but it just doesn't have the same hold on me that Top Gear has. And also, when I eventually go through my Saturn games, which I hope to do in the near future, you'll see that there's another racing game that's near and dear to my heart, and one that you would not expect because it is not one of the classic racing games. Next up, Super Mario World. This one, of course, was a pack-in game, and I definitely had this when I got my system. I'm pretty sure that the 3 games that I had starting out were actually Super Mario World, Turtles in Time, Super Wrestlemania. But I don't know that with 100% certainty. And I don't remember when I picked up Top Gear, but I know it was fairly early on. So, back to Super Mario World. All of you know what this is. This is my first foray into the world of Mario. I played this game a good deal. Pretty much every time I would switch my RF adapter from Genesis to Super Nintendo, usually Mario would be in the top 4 or 5 games I'd play. I never beat it. I actually have never beaten a platform game in my entire life because I'm not great with my hands and I just can't time jumps. So for me, the movement away from platform jumpers has been life-changing in the best possible way. So, Super Mario World, though, I did enjoy it a great deal. I remember the early stages very well. And for me, I suppose it was also an A. It's one of those things where I knew it wasn't really my kind of game, but for what it was very good. At the same time, I also didn't really play all that much Sonic. The Sonic game I had as a kid was Sonic 3. I played it, but not to the same extent that I played a lot of the games I was really into at the time, beat-em-ups and the like. Speaking of which, we have TMNT 4, Turtles in Time, the port of the arcade classic, which was, I think, improved in the home version because they added a little more content. Famously, this game has a little bit of Mode 7 when you throw enemies at the screen, and that comes into play in a boss fight. This is an example of a time when sort of that stereotype about the difference between SNES versus Genesis got turned on its head. Typically, SNES games looked and sounded better, but played a little more stiffly than their Genesis counterparts. In this case, if you compare this with Hyperstone Heist, it's reversed. Hyperstone Heist looks better, it has better color, and it also sounds a little better, at least in my opinion, but Turtles in Time is way smoother. It's more fluid, you have more attack options, you move across the screen with a little more urgency, and the level design being based directly on the arcade is, I think, substantially better. For me, Turtles in Time is in the running for best beat-em-up of the 16-bit era, and that's saying a lot given that this was the golden age of the 2D beat-em-up. It's my personal favorite SNES game, and if I had to rate all 16-bit games, it's definitely top 5. So Turtles in Time for me, unsurprisingly, is an S. Next up, we have my first experience of 16-bit wrestling games. Those of you who ever played this game, Super Wrestlemania, or Royal Rumble, or WWF Raw, know exactly what I'm talking about. In these games, they were very stiff. It was mostly punching and kicking, and everybody go, and then they also had a choking effect, Horrible sounds, and when I'd play this in the background, this was one that my parents would always insist that I turn down. Although usually I had my own room and space to play these games. But, yeah, they didn't change these for a number of years, and from about 1991 to 1994 or 5, this was pretty much every wrestling game. So I was pretty disappointed with this over time. And part of the reason why I was disappointed is because the gameplay was so limited. I could never really figure out how to do things like tag. I never figured out how to do tag team matches for that reason. Now, I did come back to it over and over because I was a huge wrestling fan as a kid, and as you can see on the cover, you got some of my favorite wrestlers ever. You've got Hogan and Savage featured prominently. You also have guys who don't show up in a lot of these games. You had Earthquake, there were the Road Warriors, a number of guys who are hard to get in wrestling games because they were sort of on their way out right as wrestling games were starting to come into vogue. And I don't count NES games in this because I never had an NES as a kid, and those games are even worse. Also, I read magazine reviews about WWF Royal Rumble, both the Genesis and SNES version, and people were talking about what an upgrade it was. So I was kind of hoodwinked into thinking that I had an inferior product and that I needed to do an upgrade to get something better. So at some point in my childhood, while we were still living in Georgia, I got rid of this game. I probably sold it at a yard sale or something like that, or maybe I traded it to my uncle and he gave me something in exchange. I don't quite remember how I got rid of it, but it was not with me when we moved to Alaska in 1995. I do know that. So, for me, this game is a D. Pretty below average experience. I can't say I'm terribly fond of what happened with this, and because of the cover art, and because it had the word Super in it, I thought we were going to get the sort of a port of that game, WrestleFest, or whatever it was called, the famous wrestling arcade game from the early 90s, late 80s that kicked ass. I think they made a home release of that on virtual consoles recently for the modern systems. I'll have to look into that, because if so, that's one that I'm picking up on Xbox. Next up is Super Double Dragon, one of the more forgotten games in the Double Dragon franchise. Most people remember the first two games on NES and an arcade, but a lot of people have forgotten that there was a Super Nintendo version of the game as well. This is a game that I got on sale somewhere. I think we're in the mall at EB or one of those stores at the time. This was before GameStop. And this was on sale for $20 in the bargain bin. And I think that my dad just bought it for me kind of on a whim because it looked interesting. He knew I was into beat-em-ups. And he wanted to keep me happy, I guess, because we'd been out shopping a long time. So ended up taking this home, and it became one of the games that I played over and over. On an objective level, I don't think this is that great of a beat-em-up. The gameplay is pretty slow, and while it is decent looking, it won't blow you away, and the character sprites are kind of small and not all that detailed, so in many ways it kind of looks like an early Genesis game. Soundtrack is okay, it's not super smooth, it's actually sort of an upgraded version of the old 8-bit soundtrack, because it's sort of a remake of the original, but not really. A little hard to explain, but a lot of the layout is similar, just with more content. That being said, it is a smart beat-em-up, in the sense that you have multiple options for how to defeat your enemies. You can utilize blocks and holds and throws in a way that is very unusual in these games, and it's well executed, so the control is great, even if it isn't super responsive or quick. And this is one that I still replay about every year or two. I have fond memories of it, but again, not necessarily a great game on an objective level. Nonetheless, these are my memories of that time, so for me, Super Double Dragon is a solid B. And Actually, having played a lot more Double Dragon in the years since, because I always thought this must be a good franchise, because clearly this game must have been the black sheep, because no one ever talked about it. So I looked up and played all of the other games in the franchise, and I find actually this is the best one. The other ones all fucking suck. And I'm not kidding. I think the rest of the Double Dragon franchise is mostly trash. The only two games in the franchise that I think are still worth playing at all, the GBA, Game Boy Advance version of Double Dragon, which is pretty playable. And then there's also a version that came out for Xbox 360 and PS3 called Double Dragon Neon, which is kind of like a high-gloss 2D beat-em-up, comparable to something like Street Fighter 4, Streets of Rage 4, excuse me, or what's the other one that is a big deal? Beat and Rage, or whatever it's called. Rage and Beat. I don't remember the exact name of it, but yeah, something along those lines. Okay, next up we have Street Fighter 2 Turbo, or maybe it's Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, I'm not sure, but this was the second attempt at Street Fighter 2 on the SNES. The original attempt was one that made people complain it was too slow. So by the time that I got it, I got the Turbo Edition. And mostly I got this just because of game reviews and the popularity of the game. It was sort of one of those where everyone talked about how good it was, so I requested it for my birthday or Christmas and ended up getting it. And this is one where I never really became a big Street Fighter fan once I had it at home and got some time with it. Now, I did play this game, but for me, it just didn't really click on a personal level. It's one of those games where I played it, I realized it was a good game, but it wasn't really for me. And also, I happened to play Street Fighter 2 Special Championship Edition, the Genesis port, and that was a game I always preferred. Now, I guess the consensus around the internet these days is that Turbo is the way to go, it was the shit, and Special Championship Edition was kind of the consolation prize. Personally, I have always felt from the early 90s until today that it's the exact opposite. Special Championship Edition, to me, ran more smoothly. I like the gameplay better, and partly it's because I have a bias in favor of the Genesis controller. If I'm going to be doing something that is potentially high stress and requires rapid response, I prefer Genesis because the D-pad is a lot looser and more responsive. So yeah, I don't have this game anymore. I don't remember when I got rid of it. It would have been later. I think I still had this when we got to Alaska. And I got rid of it at some point, probably at a yard sale or something like that. And it was only as an adult when I picked up another copy of Street Fighter 2, and not surprisingly, it was Special Championship Edition for the Genesis that I ended up picking up. And because, again, I'm not a big Street Fighter 2 guy, that's a game I rarely, if ever, play. But I do like to have it on hand in case I have an occasional game night and somebody wants to do some Street Fighter 2. For me, Street Fighter 2 Turbo was a C. It was alright. Served its purpose, scratched what little itch I had for Street Fighter 2, and I was able to move on. Next up is a case where I dodged a massive bullet, and where having subscriptions to game magazines such as GamePro, Game Players, and Next Gen really came in handy. So I mentioned before that I sort of felt compelled to try Street Fighter 2 because of game magazines and my peers at school and whatnot. Well, Tournament Fighters is one that no one else talked about, and say my uncle, who was 11 years older than me and had more mature taste in gaming, he wouldn't be interested in this because he wasn't into Ninja Turtles, but I certainly was. For me, having a Turtles fighting game sounded fucking awesome. And I realized there were two versions, the SNES version and the Genesis version. And ideally, once I learned that there were differences between them, I kind of wanted to get both, but then I saw consistently that the Genesis version was not getting good reviews. And the screenshots looked kind of shitty. So I ended up requesting the SNES version. And that was a wise move on my part, because in the years since I have tried the Genesis version, and that is one of the worst fighting games ever made. I don't know how it got average reviews in the magazines, because that game is fucking terrible. They must have had to have bribed somebody to get those reviews, because if you think that Tournament Fighters on Genesis deserves sort of in the middle on any ranking, then you're completely full of shit and you have never played it. That game sucks. And as for Tournament Fighters on SNES, it's fairly average, maybe a little above average. It's nothing spectacular, but it's not bad. It's not as good as something like, say, Mortal Kombat or even Street Fighter 2 on a technical level, but it does have some flow to it. It had multiple game modes. You could play as the Shredder, you can play as some other villains I wasn't familiar with. There was some girl who would throw her ass at opponents, so you could defeat people by hitting them in the face with somebody's ass, which is kind of neat. The turtles all fight differently and control well. Donatello, just like always in the 16-bit games, is pretty dominant, but not prohibitively so. It did have some game balance issues. There were certain enemies who were difficult to defeat. But for the most part, I think that it was a very solid game. Or at least, just plain solid. So in terms of something that just kind of ripped off something that they knew kids would buy, I think they did a decent job. I did not feel ripped off by the game. But at the same time, it's one that I realized had its limitations, but still play. Anyway, for me, Tournament Fighters is a C. Now, for the most part, I feel like I had a less sheltered childhood when it came to being able to experience media than most people. My parents let me watch Beavis and Butthead in small doses, even when I was about a third grader. I got 32X Doom when I was a 4th or 5th grader. And I also got to play the Mortal Kombat games when I was, 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade or whatever. But one thing that my parents did do was to make sure I got the SNES version rather than the Genesis version, because they knew that the Genesis version had blood in it. And at the time I was upset because, again, as I mentioned, I've always preferred Genesis, and I knew about the blood thing, and based on the blood issue alone, a lot of people to this day say that Mortal Kombat on Genesis is better than the Super Nintendo. But I stuck with the SNES version, and you know what? It's a fine game. Later on, I played the Genesis version, and I realized, actually, the SNES version looks and sounds and feels better. The 4-button layout on the SNES controller is really, really good for Mortal Kombat games. So I'm actually glad that this is the version that I had as a kid. This is the version that I believe is the best one, at least out of the two major ones. My actual favorite Mortal Kombat is the Sega CD version, which has 6-button compatibility, has blood without a code, has music and sound that are even better than the SNES version, and aside from loading times with fatalities, which I think is justifiable because it builds suspense, and then the Shang Tsung transformations, which, okay, that's annoying. Aside from those issues, pretty damn close to arcade perfect. So the Sega CD version, once I picked that up, that was the one. But the SNES version is damn good, and I give it a solid A. One of the more competent ports, especially when you think about how hard it is to convert arcade games onto 16-bit consoles and how many compromises had to be made on so many of them. The SNES version, pretty damn competent, and I played it a fair amount, so if there were any flaws in it, I would be quite aware. And it really just is a very good game. Having experienced SNES and then the Sega CD version, when I eventually did pick up the Genesis version as an adult, that was one which has been collecting dust ever since I picked it up at whatever game store I found it at. It just doesn't compare with what else I have available. Alright, next up we have UN Squadron, and I remember picking this up. I'd gone with my mom to Blockbuster, and we were looking for movies that night, and they happened to be having a game sale of old rentals they were getting rid of, and this one happened to be in the bin. Now, I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was only $10, so I managed to talk her into getting it for me. Or maybe she just said, like, yeah, if you find something cheap that you want, let me know. Now, I didn't know what this was. I just saw that it had jets on it. And as a kid, just like everybody who grew up in the era of American triumphalism, I knew what the F-14 was, and I knew that it was awesome. So if you see the cover, you can see that there's a pilot, and behind him he has two wingmen, both of whom are flying F-14s. The game actually does feature F-14, so that was correct advertising. And so I picked up this cartridge, and I played the shit out of it. This game was one of my absolute favorites. I'm usually not a huge fan of side-scrolling shooters, but I do love, or at least at the time, I really loved any game with aircraft in it. And so this one was one that blew away my expectations, because this ended up being, aside from Turtles in Time, my favorite game for the platform. And it's one that I kind of got randomly. I don't even know if originally I was planning to go with my mom. I think it was kind of a last-minute thing. And then I just went with her and saw it, got it, ended up getting one of my best games ever. Sadly, my original cartridge for UN Squadron died, and I had to replace it as an adult, but I still have the game. It's one that is still in my rotation. This game is hard as shit, by the way. I've only beaten this game 5 total times out of probably 100 attempts. If I go back to whenever I picked this up around 2nd or 3rd grade. And I beat this 4 times as a kid when I was playing it a lot. I revisited it as a teenager to take a break from the PS2 era, and I managed to beat it once. And then as an adult, I've played it probably 10 to 15 times, and I've never gotten past the penultimate boss. Because there's one boss on the second to last stage where your weapons are not ideal for hitting him, and the only way you can possibly have a chance is if you have the most advanced jet that you can outfit with like every weapon. And even then, you have shit flying at you the whole time, and it's insane, and this guy takes a mountain of punishment. That's really the only flaw in the game, though, is that the difficulty on the second to last stage is unreal. If not for that, if they made that part just a little bit easier, this would be my favorite game over Turtles in Time. But because that second to last battle is excessive, it's only my second favorite game, but it still gets into the S tier. And now that I've experienced more Super Nintendo games, I don't know if it'd still be my second favorite. Turtles in Time is still my favorite, but UN Squadron is probably still top 5, even though I've, branched out and learned a lot about other SNES games that are out there. And it's still an ongoing process. I still haven't really spent a lot of time with, say, Star Fox yet, although, of course, I have it and I know about it. So, my list of favorites is fluid, and I like to keep experiencing things that I missed out on. And, so UN Squadron has fallen from second place to probably like 3rd or 4th or 5th or whatever, but still near and dear to my heart, and I still remember the soundtrack. Even though the soundtrack wasn't exactly spectacular, it was still something that was memorable and that I have fond memories of. So all of that happened when I was between 1st and 3rd grade. All of the games I just laid out. And then we moved to Alaska. That was 4th and 5th grade. I got a Saturn, and we moved back to Virginia. My dad was in the military, just for context. That's when I got my PS1. We moved out to Kansas at some point late when we were in Kansas. That's when we upgraded to PS2. Or maybe it was right after we got to Virginia. I think it was before we left Kansas. We got PS2 at the very end. So most of my tenure in Kansas when I was, 8th to 10th grade, most of that was PS1. So this is also when I first started to discover RPGs and some of the genres that I hadn't been into before. And at that point, we went to Toys R Us. And for whatever reason, they happened to have, I guess, some reprinted SNES games. They were only $10 to $15. I happened to have some money. And, it was kind of an exciting opportunity. I guess I started to experience old school gaming nostalgia a little bit before most people, and I would still replay my SNES and Genesis stuff on occasion. As I mentioned, I would still play UN Squadron from time to time. So I picked up Urban Strike and Castlevania 4. Urban Strike, I did not know at the time, was the 3rd part of the Strike trilogy. I had played Desert Strike for Genesis before, or maybe it was Jungle Strike, one of the two, because I'd rented it, or maybe played it with my uncle, I don't remember. So I knew Urban Strike would be a good game, and so it was. Today, I wouldn't play the SNES version because the Genesis version is better set up. The game was really optimized for the Genesis because that's where EA knew it would sell the most games. And I have all 3 games on Genesis, so if I were going to play through the trilogy, which I do kind of hope to do on one rainy day, it will be there rather than on the Super Nintendo. But I did get to experiment with the game, and I realized what a good series this is, and for me, Urban Strike is a solid B. Another thing to keep in mind is that, as I mentioned, I may have already had a PS2 by then. I definitely had a PS1. So, while these games were a nice addition and kind of a cool novelty, they weren't exactly going to dethrone the games I was playing at the time, such as Allied General, and I think I had Final Fantasy VII, maybe even Final Fantasy VIII by this point. Tekken 3, Soul Blade. I mean, he had a lot of stuff that was not going to get knocked off by Urban Strike. And Super Castlevania 4. I also picked this up at the time. Castlevania is a franchise that I didn't really appreciate fully until a little later. Now, I did play it and I realized that that opening song in this game kicks ass, and that the gameplay is smooth, the whip effects are cool. But yeah, I guess I just have usually lacked the patience to deal with games that involve a lot of platforming. So for me, Castlevania is one of those things that I always kind of have put on the back burner as something I will do eventually. And eventually still has not happened, but it is one that I do plan to play at some point in greater depth and try to beat. From what I understand, this is one of the easier games in the series. I've come close to beating Castlevania Bloodlines on the Genesis, which is a harder game. So I figure if I can get pretty close on that one, I should be able to beat this one. And that's something maybe I'll try to do this fall. See if I can beat Castlevania 4 once and for all. Because I haven't been playing a lot of SNES lately, and now that I'm reviewing a lot of these games, I'm starting to feel the itch again. For me, Castlevania 4 was a B, largely for the same reason Urban Strike is. I mean, it didn't exactly revolutionize my understanding of gaming, but at the same time, it was something that I had missed, clearly a high-quality game, and I was pretty thrilled to get it and play around with it. And it's one that I've revisited now and again over the years, but one that I haven't really put in the time needed to beat it. And the copy that I got at that time, I think I still had the box for it, and then by this time I knew Sean, so this is 2010 or so, and he was trying to get a copy of Castlevania, and he couldn't find one, so he basically begged me to sell him his, so I did, and I picked up another one later. So anyway, that was my history with Castlevania 4. So yeah, hopefully this was interesting. I mean, probably wasn't that interesting, but maybe a few of you sat through this bullshit. In the future, I will go through my Sega CD, Sega Saturn collections, and maybe I will then do a Genesis or PlayStation list. Those, of course, will be much longer. And also a PS2 list. And with the PS2, that one is a little more complicated because that was actually my primary gaming system from the time I got it when I was about 15 or so in 2001 until 2013. It was only in 2013 when I got an original Xbox, and then in 2015 when I finally got an Xbox 360. And then 2019 is when I got my Xbox One, and that's still where I'm at right now in terms of my most advanced hardware. But anyway, so PS2 would be a bit of a long one. It might be sort of a marathon. Unless I just reduce it to the games I played as a kid / teenager. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what I come up with. Anyway, these are my favorite my childhood SNES games. And hopefully this gets this channel back on track and I will produce more content in the near future. Until then, I'm Thersites. This has been WTF Gas Podcast. Good night, and I will see you all around.